Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Straub, and I am a PhD student studying English, literacy, writing, and rhetoric at the University of Maryland, College Park. This morning, my presentation is titled Losing Our Habits of Mind, Dismantling the Implications of Neurotypical Thinking Behind Cognition and Writing Research. I will begin now. Why are your grades getting so bad in reading? You love reading, my mother exclaimed. I was in fourth grade at this point, at the age when childhood seemed to reach its peak, and each moment was filled with playgrounds, friends, and sunshine. My teacher that year, a boisterous blonde woman with eyes like a hawk, was frustrated by my inattention in class and my inability to finish anything I was supposed to be reading. Once the star reader of the class, the student who devoured book after book and always finished reading first in the class, now struggled to get through one chapter, which my teacher took as an inability to comprehend what I was reading and accordingly assigned me C's and D's on my assignments. At my teacher's suggestion, my mother took me to a child psychiatrist who could help diagnose the root of this issue. After rounds of bizarre questionnaires and feeling like the kid version of a lab rat, they decided I had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. My own experience of this disability wasn't severe enough to warrant the controversial drug Ritalin, especially since I did not have behavioral issues. I was just frustratingly bored in class. Rather, my ADHD was something my parents were told I would have to overcome with increased discipline and patience. As a 9-year-old child, this diagnosis seemed strange to me. Truly, I was just bored in class, which made me tap on the table incessantly, whisper to my friends, and gaze out the window longingly at the playground. This sort of narrative isn't unique to me. The pipeline from being bored in class to receiving an ADHD diagnosis is common among neurodivergent students. Processing information and problem solving are tasks that require sustained focus for longer periods of time, which remained difficult for me throughout my K-12 years. Fast forward to college. As an English major, when I began to become interested in theories and processes of writing, I learned about the term habits of mind, which was a framework that preached about the cognitive habits that lead one to conduct the writing process well. My first encounter with this term left me feeling alienated because I knew that whatever these habits of mind were that I was supposed to develop, my process of doing so would be way different from what my writing teachers wanted, because I knew my process was different from the norm. In this presentation, I explore the common use of the term habits of mind in composition scholarship and pedagogical texts, particularly in the reemergence of cognition and composition studies as it links modes of cognitive thinking to success. The popularly titled Framework for Success in Post-Secondary Writing, published in 2011, defines habits of mind as, quote, ways of approaching learning that are both intellectual and practical that can, quote, help students succeed in a variety of fields and disciplines, end quote. Yet, if we trace the origins of this term to its genesis in educational psychology, fronted by education scholars Arthur L. Costa and Beta Kalick, we can see that habits of mind was conceptualized with neurotypical students in mind. This is evident in Costa and Kalick's definition of habits of mind, which for them means, quote, that we value one pattern of intellectual behaviors over another, and requires, quote, making choices about which patterns we should use at a certain time. I argue that while this new cognitive turn in composition studies has great potential to focus on the diversity of writing processes that students employ, attention to the neurodivergent students' processes of cognition must be considered alongside our instruction of habits of mind. Specifically for the student with learning disabilities, mental illnesses, or students like me with ADHD, our processes of cognition, or our, quote, habits of mind, operate differently than what the simplicity of the scholarship belies. By comparing what psychological research on cognitive habit formation says with what composition theory says on cognitive transfer and habits of mind, I argue that composition teacher scholars must be open to exploring and accommodating how neurodivergent students will embrace cognitive processes that work for them. More concerningly, we must remain aware of the ways this normative language on cognition can feel isolating to the neurodivergent student. I contend that it is not necessary to entirely be rid of these terms or even the newer cognitive theories arising in composition studies, but rather that we must apply more empathy to conceptualizing how neurodivergent writers will locate the habits of mind that work for them. The aim of this presentation is to promote more inclusivity in composition theory and to encourage composition teachers to accommodate to the neurodivergent student when teaching the writing process. Habits of mind in composition scholarship has been a recent emergence that links classroom values such as empathetic listening and respect with patterns of thinking in the classroom. In first-year composition pedagogy, the Framework for Success in Post-Secondary Writing has established the 8 habits of mind for college writing success: curiosity, openness, engagement, creativity, persistence, responsibility, flexibility, and metacognition. Peggy O'Neill et al. Assert that this framework offers an alternative to the list of set goals or outcomes as markers for student success. Quote, by focusing on habits of mind rather than discrete outcomes, the framework suggests that college and career readiness in writing depends on broader understandings of reading and writing activities, end quote. Habits of mind are fostered in the FYC classroom for the purpose of equipping students with the cognitive patterns that prepare them to succeed in college and beyond. The introduction of the phrase habits of mind dovetails with the reemergence of cognitive psychology and writing pedagogy scholarship. Ellen C. Carrillo in 2017 notes that this is especially true in recent years, as a social constructivist perspective is now shifting to tracing intellectual processes behind composition, especially with the popularity of transfer theory. Carrillo argues that, quote, after decades of privileging sociocultural approaches to understanding and teaching writing, the last few years have seen an increase in the number of studies that explore how individuals' dispositions affect the transfer of writing knowledge, end quote. In other words, Linda Flower and John R. Hayes' early 1980s understanding of cognitive rhetoric is experiencing somewhat of a resurgence. This refocus on individual cognition serves mostly to support transfer theory as conceptualized by Kathleen Blake Yancey, Leanne Robertson, and Kara Tazak, which posits that students must develop the metacognitive skills in the writing classroom that will allow them to transfer their knowledge to other contexts beyond school. Importantly, per transfer theory, habits of mind are a prerequisite for fostering this transferability because habits imply an adopted way of thinking for all contexts of life, rather than a contextual set of outcomes. According to composition scholar Patrick Sullivan, for writing teachers, the habits of mind in composition typically links classroom values such as openness and responsibility with research in cognitive psychology that maps how students learn to develop and repeat process-oriented tasks over time. Sullivan notes that this research supports that, quote, intellectual dispositional habits of mind may be more valuable to students, especially in the long run, than knowledge about traditional subjects at the center of most writing instruction, end quote. This connection between discipline and cognitive intellect here stems back to the origin of the phrase habits of mind. Sullivan cites Costa and Calic's 2008 book, Learning and Leading with Habits of Mind, 16 Essential Characteristics for Success as the foundational text of habits of mind. In this book, Costa and Calic contend that intelligence can be learned through behavioral discipline. They state that, quote, the habits of mind provide a set of behaviors that discipline intellectual processes. Taken as a whole, the many definitions and interpretations of what is meant by intelligence lead us to conclude that the habits of mind can be cultivated, articulated, operationalized, taught, fostered, modeled, and assessed, end quote. To show that habits of mind are not considerant of neurodivergent cognitive patterns, I compare what composition scholars have said about the habits of mind that lead to success in psychological research on neurodivergent cognition. If we take ADHD as an example of neurodivergent thinking, we can see how the typical patterns of thinking in ADHD are not directly conducive to fostering habits of mind. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, states that ADHD, quote, is a persistent pattern of inattention or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. Inattention manifests behaviorally in ADHD as wandering off task, lacking persistence, having difficulty sustaining focus, and being disorganized, and is not due to defiance or lack of comprehension, end quote. Comparatively, one of Casa and Calic's habits of mind is, quote, managing impulsivity. Casa and Calic state that to manage impulsivity, students, quote, need to practice using think time to decrease their impulsivity in everything they do, end quote. They offer that managing impulsivity is a matter of giving students more time to focus before jumping to conclusions right away, which will in turn lead students to develop, quote, a deeper level of analytical thinking, end quote. Particularly in linking discipline to success, Casa and Calic contend that, quote, less impulsivity, self-disciplined students are more successful, end quote. Similarly, the framework for success in post-secondary writing lists persistence as one of the key habits of mind, which they define as, quote, the ability to sustain interest and attention to short and long-term projects, end quote. For the person with ADHD, such as myself, this habit of sustaining attention and interest is not as easy as it might be for neurotypical learners, but more problematically, linking these skills to success implies that students who do not have this natural neural ability will struggle to foster the habits that lead to success. Moreover, exploring neurobiological research on ADHD can help us see that this habit is psychologically harder to develop than it is for the neurotypical thinker. For example, a research study from Amit O. Cecily et al. Out of Rutgers University shows that the mind of the ADHD person lacks as strong of an ability to perform goal-oriented control, specifically in the formation of goal-driven habits. They propose that because the ADHD brain tends to crave immediacy, the habits ADHD people form are more cue-driven rather than goal-driven. By analyzing how the prefrontal cortex operates in a stimulus response outcome test during an fMRI scan, they suggest that there may be more biomarkers of the ADHD person's brain that makes them less likely to form habits that will help them to achieve their long-term goals. Their results conclude that because the ADHD person's prefrontal cortex, specifically the DACC and the VMPFC regions, develops slowly or differently from the neurotypical person, the ADHD person may have a harder time forming goal-directed habits. Accordingly, because the habits of mind that preach persistence and sustained attention link neurotypical thinking to goal-directed success, they ignore how the processes of cognition embedded into a person's neural biology are harder to overcome for the purpose of goal-directed success. While the exclusion of ADHD and emotional disorder cognition patterns is just one way in which habits of mind speak for neurotypical thinking, in my view, the most problematic notion in which habits of mind, the most problematic notion behind the habits of mind is its equation with habitual cognitive processes with long-term success in a variety of contexts. My fear is that because habits of mind are grounded in the neurotypical thinker's cognition process that, quote, value one pattern of intellectual behaviors over another, end quote, they imply that the neurotypical cognitive habits are the key to success. This is reflected both in Casa and Calic's work and in composition transfer theory. For example, the framework for success in post-secondary writing, quote, identifies the habits of mind as a kind of writing experiences that will best prepare students for success as they enter, courses in which they will work to achieve those outcomes, end quote. This suggests that transfer skills are the goal behind implementing the habits of mind, which tracks with what transfer theorists Kara Tazek and Leanne Robertson contend when they say, quote, transfer is the goal of all teaching of writing. They also contend that, quote, by developing cognitive, metacognitive, and reflective knowledge and practices that allow for transfer, students can better cultivate the habits of mind that lead to increased success in college, end quote. This applies that the habits of mind that promote cognition, metacognition, and reflection developed in the writing classroom will necessarily transfer to other contexts in college and encourage student success for all types of learners. But psychological research shows that for all learners, the cognitive link between habitual activities and accomplishing long-term goals isn't necessarily as causal as we tend to believe. Rather, repeated encounters with the same context are more influential in habit formation, and habits often form independent of goals. A study from well-regarded specialists in habitual psychology, David T. Neal, Wendy Wood et al., reveals that in cognitive processes of association, people do not causally link the habits of mind they perform on a daily basis to their goals, and rather, habits form through a recurrence of circumstances in daily life. Their research shows that, quote, although habit strength is relative, many everyday activities are likely performed by people suffering frequency in stable context to achieve direct context, cueing without influence of goals. For example, morning grooming, eating, etc. Second, goals were important for judgment about habits. That is, more habitual runners strongly believed and rapidly inferred that their running was influenced by their goals, end quote. In other words, our goals influence how we judge our established habits, which is not necessarily the same thing as habits forming towards the accomplishment of goals. Neal et al. Conclude that their research, quote, suggests that these strong habits, although perceived to be purposive and goal-dependent, are actually influenced by recurring triggers in the performance context, end quote. Further, habits are contextually formed in relation to the recurrence of the circumstances that form such habits, which may arise apart from one's goals. While they found that goals influence moderately strong habits, their findings, quote, suggest that performance contexts with minimal influence of goals automatically trigger mental representations of associated habitual responses, end quote. In other words, habits form when people repeatedly encounter the same context under which the habit began to be formed. As I was writing now in 2021, habits of mind are fully secured in their position in composition scholarship and FYC curricula, and I would like to stress that I'm not suggesting that we abandon this framework. Rather, I ask that we directly interrogate its implications for the neurodivergent student and focus on methods of accommodation when we teach these pedagogical principles. It is important to note that this reintroduction of individual cognition and its foundation of habits of mind is only in its nascent stage for composition studies. Scholars like John R. Hayes hopes that the field of writing will become more open to intersecting sociocultural research with cognition research. He states, quote, perhaps in the coming decades, researchers in English departments will integrate cognitive science and neuroscience in their studies of writing to design more effective research programs and more effective writing instruction, end quote. I'd argue that if we are to do this in the coming decades, research on neurodivergent cognition should be directly incorporated into new designs for writing programs in order to include the mentally disabled. I would also like to call upon composition scholars and teachers to consider how cognitive theories of composition tend to link neurotypical patterns of cognition to success. Composition scholars like Margaret Price are slowly beginning to understand how the ways we talk about writing and teaching of writing are embedded in normative understandings of neurocognition. Price's book, Mad at School, Rhetorics of Mental Disability and Academic Life, argues that the effects of mental disabilities are often equated with patterns of unsuccessful behavior in higher ed and that the mentally disabled person has a hard time navigating the university sphere because of how academics are predicated on neurotypical cognition. Price shows that, quote, some of the most important common topoi of academe intersect problematically with disability, topoi that include criticality, coherence, and presence. These topoi that Price lays out are parallel to how the habits of mind eschew considerations of mental disability and neurodivergent cognition. As Price argues, quote, we are still missing a careful examination of the ways that higher education clings to the notion that mental disability must be an aberration, something that emerges only rarely, and when it does emerge, should be stifled or expunged as quickly as possible, end quote. Price's work and my analysis of habits of mind might serve as a call to expand how we conceptualize and teach the habits of mind in the classroom. My presentation today has shown that the framework of, quote, habits of mind has a tradition embedded in neurotypical ways of thinking, which can exclude how our disabled and neurodivergent students develop their writing. While my presentation is, first and foremost, a call for us to foreground the neurodivergent student in theories of composition, it is also an invitation for us to all imagine more inclusive futures for disabled students in the writing classroom. Higher education has a long history of privileging the able-bodied person, and while disability scholars and activists have made important headway in making the university a more inclusive space, there's much more work that needs to be done to welcome and include the neurodivergent student in the classroom. Critical questioning of the common assumptions behind our pedagogical values is just one place we can start to make the writing classroom a friendly space for the neurodivergent. That concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. If you have questions or you would like to contact me, feel free to email me at straupr@umd.edu. That's STROUPR@umd.edu. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Thank you, 4Cs.